The beautiful woodwork in our home is one of the very first things that attracted us to it, but it did not always look like this, and this isn't even finished. It was a total mess when we moved in. Everything in this home that was wood, beautiful original wood, was painted peach at some point in time before the 90s. And the previous owners had actually gotten like a really good head start on trying to remove some of that peach paint, but they never finished the project. So from one new homeowner to possibly another, here's how we used a heat gun that was bestowed upon us by the previous owners to remove the paint from the wood. I'd like to start with some safety tips, and disclaimer, obviously I'm not a professional. This is not professional advice. I'm just a girl who moved into a home and wanted to tackle a DIY project. So first things first, you should have a mask. Get some masks. You're gonna need these for probably a million other projects around the house anyway. I'd recommend some safety goggles, because not only are we using the heat gun, but there's also like an element of chipping involved, and you don't want to get that in your eye. Gloves. Before we started using gloves, both me and my husband were caught in the crosshairs, and that's not a mistake you make twice. These aren't even heat resistant gloves, they're just painter's gloves. But when you feel the fabric start to get warm before your skin gets warm, it's like, okay, let's take a break, take a pause, give it a few seconds to cool down, and then get right back into it. So those are the three like basic like safety items I recommend. Now for tools, obviously number one, you're gonna want a heat gun. And you want two things that look like this, and I don't technically know what they are. Maybe it's a putty knife, I'm not sure. And then whatever this is. They were both in the painting section at our hardware store. So you want two because one can be used to scrape the paint while the other is used to clean the main scraper. So while I was working, I had a t-shirt next to me on the floor. So I would use one to scrape up the paint, and then when we were done, I would go over and I would take this other one to clean it off, like sharpening a knife, right? To like degunk it onto the shirt and then get right back into it. And then when I was done, I would just throw the shirt out because it's a rag. So like easy cleanup, but I really discovered that using the two at once, it was just so efficient. Also, this one is slightly flexible. We started using this one, which is more stiff and more sharp, but it was actually occasionally like scratching the wood, damaging the wood. So I switched to using the flexible one as the main instrument, and then this was the cleaner. All right, so we have safety, we have tools, heat gun versus flat surface. So like here is like a beautiful, perfect flat surface. When we first got started, we didn't realize how easy it could be. We definitely like went into it wrong at first. We'd wait for the paint to just get hot enough and then just go at it in like multiple short motions. Don't do that. Instead, if you're blessed with a beautiful flat surface, I recommend choosing a comfortable starting point and holding the heat gun steady until a good bubble forms, and then follow that. Make a nice little bubble trail where you can see the paint lifting up off the wood. But don't wander too far because the trail will begin to cool behind you. You'll develop a natural feel for this very quickly, probably depending on, which heat gun you're using. So after you have your bubble and your bubble trail, you want to break into that space. So I learned a trick here that once you break in, once you kind of pop that bubble and you're in, you can angle the heat gun to go up under the bubble to really start to lift the paint away from the wood from the inside. So once you have your bubble path established, you've applied some heat from the inside and everything is still warm, you can just glide. It was most comfortable for me to start at a lower point and work my way up, but you'll figure out what's most comfortable for you too, what angles you like and how your heat gun works. I don't know if it's different if you're like left versus right-handed. This is just what worked for me. And we had developed with the heat gun a really good rhythm where I would get a head start and I'd be zooming in and I'd be getting off as much as I could. My husband would be right behind me with the sander, not right behind me, like maybe half a room behind me. So he would just come in and sand over what I had just done. Now the woodwork in our home isn't very intricate or complicated. There's no like scrolling or any of that, but it is still much more difficult to deal with like a curved surface versus just like a beautiful flat surface. So on the baseboards where we ran into this, I angled the heat gun up, waited for things to warm up, and then slid my tool along the flat surface, kind of like a seam ripper, trying to get the edge of the curved surface to open. And the paint from the seam would begin to curl up, and then I would look for an opportunity where it's already lifted a bit away from the wood, where I would stick my, kind of like opening a curtain, I'd stick, not this one, I'd stick this tool in and kind of open it just a little bit, just enough to get to angle that heat up into that pocket, and again, start to let it bubble up. You really just want an access point in there so that it begins lifting by itself, again, from the inside. And this part is so important. You can, when you're like really gliding, you can like peel and glide as you go, but that's only when you hit like the perfect rhythm. But more times than not, you're gonna wanna stop, and then before you remove the paint, let it cool. Once it cools, and it takes seconds, it's hard again, and then you can just chip it off, baby. And sometimes you can chip off a bigger chunk than you would even like heat it up previously. This saved so much time to not try to physically remove all of the paint while it was still warm. Wait for it to cool, I'm telling you, and then chip it off. Sometimes you didn't even need a tool. You could just touch it lightly with your finger and it would flake off. And it was so easy to clean up if you just had a vacuum, like a handheld vacuum nearby. Now for our stairs, it's actually really difficult to maneuver the heat gun inside of these like tulip shapes, since it's, you know, it's a difficult space, it's a challenging space to work in. So I would start with angling the heat gun just on the sides and making sure I got a little bit of lift, and then again, waiting for things to cool and chipping off. It's still not done just because we wanted to move in and not deal with a mess right away. So eventually we'll have to deal with that mess and continue chipping it away. My heat kicked in, if you could hear it, but before we wrap up, I do have a couple tips, some things that I learned in the process I'd like to pass on to you. So tip number one, if you think 2 heat guns will be twice as good, you're probably not wrong, but I would strongly advise rethinking that. Our house did actually come with 2 heat guns, and at one point, one afternoon, my mom was like, let me get started on the other side of the room and we can meet in the middle. And I was like, yeah. So she plugged in the other heat gun, and it took all of 10 seconds for it to trip the power, and we lost electricity in that room. And sure, it's easy enough to go downstairs and deal with the breaker box, but if it had like truly blown a fuse or sparked or started a fire, or if anything else had gone south, it just seemed like a risk you don't need to take. Tip number 2 is that, especially with wood like this that was originally finished, as you remove paint, you're going to be removing some of the varnish too, or all of the varnish. And that is going to look like you're burning something. Like for us, it came up very brown. So I was concerned I was like burning the paint or burning the wood or something, and I wasn't, it was just the varnish. But also, if you hit a spot with a lot of varnish, it's going to be very, very sticky and gunk up your instruments. So again, make sure you have something close by that you can use to clean off your instruments. And just so you know, when you remove paint with a heat gun or with anything, it takes up the original varnish, and there's just no way around that. So I was peeling off layers and I was seeing like this beautiful, glistening, sparkling, like just beautiful wood, but then the varnish would like immediately start to melt and fry, and I was like, no, because I could see how beautiful it used to be. You're not gonna be able to get that back. You're just gonna have to strip and sand and then refinish it yourself. But the last tip is that paint can burn, so be careful, pay attention. The paint can burn, the wood can burn, and you don't want to scorch your wood, and you know, obviously your skin can burn. So pay attention. I never had our heat gun on for probably more than a minute at a time. Sometimes you can start to like smell a little bit of burning, whether it's from like the motor or the paint itself, whatever. But if you see something, if you smell something, stop. It's just safer if you just stop before anything overheats. It's a marathon, not a race. And that is how I used basically a hand-me-down heat gun to restore the wood in our home. And obviously it's not finished. This is just the raw wood, no paint, post sanding. And once it's a little warmer out in the spring and we can open the windows and get some ventilation, we will like fully refinish, pick a varnish, etc. So if you're interested in our journey, you can subscribe, follow along, and see more home renovation projects we tackle. Thank you so much for watching. Happy heat gunning. I actually loved this project. It was kind of a lot of fun for me. It was very therapeutic. So yeah, thanks for watching and good luck. Bye-bye.